All right, guys. So we're jumping into what I would consider to be the probably the module or effect that you're going to put first every time inside of Ozone 7, and that's going to be the I'm going to call it the basic equalizer, but it is a very advanced equalizer. So when you load it up, you'll see a bunch of information on the screen. It might look a little daunting at first, but this should be the first one in your chain just because of how the rest of the process of mastering is going to work. So let's analyze and listen to a little bit of this track real quick. Looking in the mirror of who I see. Took the mask off. Okay. So you'll see that in the middle, we have the audio spectrum that we already talked about how I got on by right-clicking and doing spectrum options or EQ options. Or you can go down here in the cogwheel and do equalizer or spectrum, whichever way you want to get to that. But that's why I have this little spectrum right here. And you'll see these different bands. It'll say 1, 3, 5, and 7, which looks a little bit weird, right? Because why is it going from 1, 3, 5, and 7? Well, this is telling you how many bands are active and which band is active. By default, 4 bands will be active. You'll notice that under here, though, you can turn on bands 2, 4, 6, and 8. So you'll notice that right now, obviously, it is an 8-band equalizer. So I can't go in here and double-click and create another one. Basically, it just made that number 2. So it is at most an 8-band equalizer, which is more than enough when you're working with a parametric EQ. All right, so you'll notice that for each band, they're a slightly different color, and those are illuminated both by the dot in the actual EQ visualizer as well as down below. Now, this view that we're on right now is going to be dependent on the view over here that you have selected or for the EQ view mode over at the left. So for instance, on spectrum mode, all you get is the bands that are active, which you can turn on or off by selecting the little power switch here for each band or by double-clicking. So let's just take this off. Let's say for this track, let me play this. Looking in the mirror of who I see. Let's say there was too much low end. There isn't, but let's say there was. I can double click on this, and I can double click anywhere on the other in the spectrum, and it'll automatically read where I'm clicking and activate that band. Okay, so I can turn that on. So if I click over here, I would assume it would activate number 2. Let's test that out, and it did. So with 3 here, or 1 rather, you can take it, boost it, do whatever you want. Well, you'll notice that, okay, you don't have any control over the shape of the EQ. Right now, it's just boosting and cutting in a quite wide factor. You can't really boost or touch the Q factor. So if you want to have those controls, you're going to go over here to the left where there's going to be different views for the module that you're on. And right now, we're obviously on EQ. So the first one, spectrum, is literally just the spectrum. Now, the next one is detailed band view. This will give you a lot of options for each band. So it looks a little bit confusing, but it's not. It's just 8 of the identical controls here that you see, right? So let's go over some of these controls. On the left-hand side, you have analog and digital. These are 2 different modes. So analog is analog modeling. It's trying to model an analog EQ and add some warmth, some vibe, some mojo to the EQ. Digital is going to be it's very precise, surgical. It's going to keep the linear phase intact. It's just 2 different modes. So when we get to the actual part where we're looking at using Ozone 7, this analog and digital mode, it should be a choice of, okay, with your specific track, are you trying to color it to make it sound, have a certain sound or vibe? Or is there a big problem with a part of the mix or a pretty good problem that you need to address? If you're just trying to make the track have a little bit more polish, a little bit more sheen, I would keep it on analog. But if you're going in and doing surgery on certain frequencies, I would tend to suggest leaving it on digital. Now moving over to the right, you have these different curve shapes. So right now it's on a low shelf, so that's why it's doing that shape. Let's say we wanted this band 1 to be a bell, which we wouldn't really want to do on the low end, but there it is. There's how you can control the different shapes that it's going to create. Now here's a high shelf and then a low pass. So with each mode, you have flat, resonant, and brick wall. So flat's going to be pretty normal. Resonant's going to be more of a steeper sweep. And then you get brick wall, which is pretty nice if you're trying to really take off certain frequencies and have it stop at a certain frequency. So you have those options for, you have different options for each of the different shapes or curves for the band. So for a low shelf, you get analog, which is a less surgical cut. You can see it kind of dips, rises. You get vintage, you get back sandal, and you get resonant. Now these are just different types of curves, different algorithms. So those are fun to play around with. There's no right or wrong. It just depends what you'd like to do. So if we go to, we can go to flat for here. We can go to bell. You have proportional EQ for the bell. So let's take that up. So it's going to be proportionate. You have peak, which is just going to add a little bit more of less of a noticeable rise heading into the peak. And then you have band shelf, which is going to kind of create this kind of like a plateau up near the peak. So it's kind of cool. High shelf, you have the same as you do the low shelf, the same for. And then low pass is the same as high pass. So you have those different modes. So if we go to a high pass now, and if we right click on this, you can see that you can access those options. If you're like, okay, I'm on a high pass, right? I want a brick wall. So it'll change that. You don't have to always be down here. You can be there. So what that means is you can make those changes in the first view mode where it says spectrum view, because remember, you don't get all that information, right? So if you like this view more,
looking in the mirror of who I see, I took the mask off, here's the real things, and now
right? You can make those changes without having to be on this different view. So moving over, you have frequency. It'll say the frequency where you're at, where you're scrolling, which is really nice because it's very precise, okay? And you'll see that as I scroll through this, it's moving. So right now we're at 300, 472 hertz, etc. So that's really helpful because you can really see where things are. For instance, if you wanted to tame this peak down a little bit, we could do flat, take the Q factor down a little bit.
looking in the mirror of who I see,
You can actually see where you're cutting at. So if you have a very muddy low end, you might want to cut up to about 30 hertz.
looking in the mirror of who I see, I took the
All right, the gain is gonna increase depending on the mode that you have. So let's activate another band here. Okay, so if I move this upwards now, because we're on a high shelf, we can actually see the gain amount in very precise amounts. If I double click, it'll go back to normal.
looking in the mirror of who I see, I took the mask off, here's the real me, broke the chains and now I'm living free.
Okay, so I changed this to a bell, and now we have these two little dots to the side of each and every band. This is your Q factor. It's going to be the width of the actual band itself. So if you want it very narrow, a Q of 12 is very narrow. A Q of 0.2 is very wide.
Looking in the mirror of who I see.
Now, I just want to get something out of the way really quick. In mastering, when you see mastering EQs, they're going to look a little bit different than your typical mixing EQ. So if we load up a preset, which remember we can go to here and we can load up a preset. Let's do gentle polish. Do you see how there's a bunch of little dips in the actual, there's 1, 2, 3, kind of 4, 5 different things going on, and they're kind of subtle little boosts and dips. So they're boosts and cuts, right? They're attenuated and they're boosted at times. Well, if we go to like a new track, let me do a new audio track. Actually, I'll just do it to my voice. So this is the voice, this is the track that I'm talking into. This is something that we'd all see in a kind of like a mixing EQ, right? We'd roll off the lows. My voice is going to change right now. And we might roll off the highs and do kind of this type of boost, right? Or if I'm mixing a singing voice like la 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 la, you know, I might boost some of the highs, boost a little bit of this, find where my resonant frequency is kind of living at, and add this sheen, right? So it's more of a uniform type sound. You don't see these little bumps, little edits that you typically do in mastering. So this is normal. Don't. And I wanted to touch on this now because the reason you're using ozone as opposed to just using a typical EQ is it's tailor-made for this type of EQ. It's you'll notice that it's not as drastic of an EQ as it is with the Logic one. So for instance, what we're going to do here, let's A/B this. I'm going to turn, let's actually just, we're going to go to the preset and we're going to, let's just close this actually. So we're going to just X out of this, add the equalizer again. So we have the equalizer. I'm going to turn off bands 3, 5, and 7, so it's just 1. And we're going to do a kind of a low shelf here. Or sorry, we'll do a high pass actually. All right, so I'm going to high pass up to about 200 hertz on this track.
Looking in the mirror.
All right, and now we're going to kind of A/B this with Logic's EQ, and I'm going to do a high pass up to about 200 hertz as well. So here's Logic.
Looking in the mirror of who I Looking in the mirror. Looking in the mirror of Looking in the mirror of who I see. Took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living. Looking in the mirror.
So it's a little bit different sounding. It's mainly because the algorithm, the ones and zeros, crunching those numbers, but it's perfectly fine to think of, to actually go through some of these presets and you're gonna be like, oh my God, they look different than what I do in the mix. That's fine, that's how it should be. That you shouldn't be doing broad EQ cuts and things like that in Ozone 7. You shouldn't be doing this type of stuff. If you are, it's affecting too many frequencies. And the reason you don't wanna ever do that type of EQ or this type of EQ inside of a mastering plugin or in a mastering environment means if you do see this and it makes your mix sound better, not to be rude, but you really screwed up your mix. Like, this is affecting so many instruments right here. This is from your low mids to your high mids. That could affect depending on what genre you're in, that could affect 4, 5, 6, 7 different groups of instruments. And we're talking snares, we're talking mid-range synths, your leads, plucks, pads, guitars, pianos. So that's why in a mastering environment, you typically see more narrow Q factors on your bands of EQ. That's why I got into this little tangent, because I started talking about the Q factor. So let's actually go to, we'll do digital high end, or we'll do clear bass. You'll see that everything's very narrow, the Q factor. We'll do enhanced focus, right? There's not a lot of wide ranging, wide sweeping EQs. So let's X out of that, drag it back in, and we'll just turn off 3 and 5 and keep 7 on. So this is how you can affect the Q factor here. It's just basically narrow, make it more narrow or make it wider depending on your needs. All right, so let's zero out on these different bands here. And you'll notice that there's two things kind of grayed out, regardless of whether I'm on high pass, low pass, bell, high shelf, or low pass. You'll see that it says we got these different features here that we have this -12, -24, -48, right? And we have this little phase and surgical mode grayed out. That's because we're on the analog mode right now. And I want to reiterate what the analog mode is for. It's going to color the sound. It's an algorithm that is trying to add vibe and mojo to your sound. Well, if you're in the digital mode, you'll notice that now phase becomes active as well as surgical mode. So the surgical mode the digital mode is less musical in theory than the analog mode, because a lot of gear guys, mastering engineers and engineers, they lust after the analog sound. It sounds richer, it sounds thicker, it sounds more three-dimensional. I'm not one of those dudes. I like how things sound in the digital world just as much as the analog world. It just depends on your taste. But the digital EQ algorithm is a little less musical in that it allows you to do cuts that are more harsh. They're going to be more precise. So the surgical mode allows you to really get in there and alter the shape of the curve. So for instance, if I'm in surgical mode, this is what it looks like for that third band right there. And if I go to analog, so that's a little bit different. We can really get in and do some more creative things here. So we'll go back to digital, we'll turn on surgical, and you can really get in there and add and do some crazy shapes, right? Now, outside of the actual allowing you to do kind of a more precise, weirder shape, I guess, you have the different options with phase. So the digital surgical mode allows you to do, if you have to do really drastic cuts to kind of fix a mix, or maybe you did something, you're like, oh man, there's just way too much going on here, I got to do some weird stuff. What it does, well, not weird, just things that you shouldn't have to do a whole heck of a lot. You also have this phase meter over here. All right, so things are going to get a little technical, but it's pretty cool technical stuff, I guess. So this phase slider over here is really unique and different. I would venture to go out on a limb and say it's unlike most of the phase metering or sliders you've ever seen in DAW, because at 0%, this phase is actually set to linear phase, which means that if you make an EQ cut or a boost, all the frequencies that are affected in that boost, they're going to be affected. There's going to be no delay or latency, and they're not going to affect the phase or create a little shift in the phase, either left or right, of the actual main frequency that you're cutting or boosting. And it says it's at 0%. At 100%, it's at minimum phase, which is a different type of filter, which is going to sometimes, I would prefer personally almost always to be in linear phase, just because I know with what I cut and what I do, that's what I'm going to get. And it's kind of hard to explain, but for instance, if I set this to a phase of 0%, it's actually in linear phase in digital mode. And if I cut this right here, all right, we'll boost it so we can see it. What's actually happening is there's no shift in phase, because right now the signal's traveling through and then I'm boosting these frequencies and then it's coming back down. If you're not in a linear phase, sometimes it's zero latency mode. There's gonna be a few things that can happen. There's gonna be a latency with when those frequencies are affected, and then there can also be this phase shift that happens right off center and off right depending on what type of curve you're using. So there's a VST PC plugin that does this, and I can't find one for a Mac, but basically what this shape could do is it would basically be, there's gonna be a phase difference. If I loaded up this shape in the EQ into an analyzer that looked at the phase differences that this is creating in the signal, and I'm on a minimum phase EQ, for instance, what's going to happen is there's going to be a little cut and boost just off center, left and right to my main frequency, which happens to be 688 hertz, which can add up over the course of your mix, and it can definitely add up into in a mastering environment. So if you want a very surgical cut, and you want with what you see happening on the curve to be pretty much what you're getting, are pretty, like, I would say almost 100% what you're getting with the actual EQ result in how it's affecting the sound, keep it on linear phase. You can, of course, blend between the two if you want more of a varied result, but I personally would always keep it at a linear phase, and there are instances where minimum phase can be helpful, but it requires more knowledge and I think a more fine-tuned ear and a better tuned room to hear it. But that's what that phase slider is doing. All right, so that covers pretty much everything that you're going to get in each of the bands inside, the 8 bands inside of the EQ. Let's talk about this third viewing mode. It's called the all bands view. So this will show you if you're more of a visual person or a number person. It will show you the frequency you're at, the gain, and the Q. So it's there if you want that information. Everything's the same. If you want to work in this mode, I would suggest getting used to right-clicking to change your different shapes and curves and all that sort of stuff. But you can always toggle back and forth. It's just more information if you like seeing the frequencies, the gain, the Q, and you can affect them here as opposed to on the actual graph. So if you're that type of visual person, that option exists and it's there for you to take advantage of. All right, so next under that, you have this little line. You have these 3 different modes, and this is incredibly powerful. So the nice thing about Ozone 7 is that you have 3 different equalizers. You have the equalizer, you have the vintage EQ. You actually have 4. You have the post equalizer and the dynamic EQ, but it's nice that you have those different options, because if you want to use this EQ as a mid-side, you can load up another EQ to do your cuts or anything like that. So in stereo, what's going to happen is each band is going to affect left and right and center. Right, it affects the whole stereo image. Now, there's a mid-side EQ, and I don't want to get into an entire tutorial on what mid-side EQ is, but what it does is it allows you to isolate the middle of your mix, meaning anything that's centered, and the side, which is anything out left and right. So let's listen to this chorus section real quick with it set to mid. I'm going to solo the mid frequencies. And then here's it unsoloed. So that's left and right, mid and side. So let's actually go to the side and let's solo this. All right, a few things jump out right off the bat. You're not hearing the lead vocal because that's in the middle. You're hearing the harmonies and doubles, and then you're not even hearing the right where I belong at the end. So let's do that again. Here's the mix. And here's the side. right? So you can hear that difference. Now let's solo just the mid. We're just going to hear her main lead vocal.
I can't help it, I'm shameless. Never sorry to say it. Take it or leave it, better believe I'm right where I belong. I know some of you hate it, but I'll never be shaken. Take it or leave it, better believe I'm right where I belong. Oh, you ready?
All right, so it's pretty cool because what this allows you to do in practice is allows you to, let's say in the mix, let's say I wanted to, as a mastering engineer, my mastering mindset, I wanted to affect those high harmonies. All right, just knowing where the human voice resides, I can start to affect a little bit of that and bring that out in the mix.
I can't help it, I'm shameless. Never sorry to say it. Take it or leave it, better believe I'm right where I belong. I know some of you hate it, but I'll never be shaken. Take it or leave it, better believe I'm right where I belong. Oh, you ready? I can't help it, I'm shameless.
So that's what mid-side EQ in a mastering sense allows you to do. It allows you to isolate certain elements of the mix that you may want to bring up or reduce, or maybe you just want to apply different EQ to different sections of the song. Sonically, dependent on whether you want to bring up things in the middle of the mix or the side of the mix, or maybe you want to bring them down. So you have these different modes here. When you're on stereo, if you make an edit in the stereo mode, it's going to show up as the mid-side EQ as well. And if you're in the stereo mode, you can still toggle back and forth between the side. So you also have left and right as well. Left is going to be what you make in the stereo mode, and then right's going to be the same thing as what you see in the mid side on the side. So it's just a little bit different. Side's going to be pure left and right, hard left and right. Mid side is going to include things that aren't hard pans as well. But those are the three different modes that you get inside of the equalizer in Ozone 7. So I pulled in a track by B. Bay Miller. I don't know how to say her name, but reason I did that, and you see two tracks here, is one of the cool features inside of Ozone 7 is this matching EQ that you have. So under the analog and digital modes, you have a little toggle that says matching. And if you turn it on and then click on matching, you'll see a new window appear. You'll see where it says reference audio, target audio, and match curve. Basically, what this allows you to do is it allows you to capture your reference track, because maybe you're mixing and you're trying to get your mix to sound like a certain specific track that you kind of had in mind as you're going through the mixing process. You can include that idea and that technique into your mastering process as well. So, for instance, let's say this song during the verse, I want to make sure that my track has a similar frequency curve. What you can do is you can click on reference.
Like an astronaut that's scared of.
And you can see it kind of painted in that blue line, and it freezes it. So now if I play my track again,
Looking in the mirror, love who I see. Took the mask off, here's the real me.
we can then capture that audio as well.
Looking in the mirror, love who I see. Took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free.
All right, so then you see that the yellow line represents the target audio, the audio of my track, and then we have the reference audio. So you can see that there's a lot more low end in mine than there is in the other one. So this is a great visual tool for kind of seeing, for me personally, how the low end of my mix is comparing, because my room is treated quite well, but I know there are other rooms and mastering environments out there that are treated much better than my studio. So I like to use this tip and trick or this technique to actually reference the audio in a target song. The high end's pretty good. It's pretty similar. The mid-range is pretty good. Mine's a little bit more peaky. has more peaks to it. But yeah, this is a really awesome tool to kind of get your mixes in line with your reference track, both visually, and then it can translate to what you're going to do with the EQ. So for instance, I know I need to cut out a little bit of the EQ. Let's go to analog. I'm going to apply a cut now. And if I redid that process, mine should be closer to the low end of the other track, although I'm not taking into consideration that there's a bass and kick in the beginning of this track. There isn't in this Fire and Gold one. All right, so that sums up this section of the tutorial course where we looked at the ins and outs of the equalizer inside of Ozone 7. I'll see you in the next video.